Will you not have the translators? You said that. Would you not have the translators? The demographics of publication are here. China is on the rise. The United States and the European Union are kind of flattening out. Look at these slides. This comes from the National Science Foundation. Well, it's OECD. It was in a National Science Foundation presentation. And what was interesting about this is look at the absolute numbers. These are the numbers of degrees production in China. 300,000 scientists, 700,000 engineers, and look where the rest of the world is. Think about the imperatives of those kinds of things. So cultural change, particularly intellectual property and privacy. There's a different sense of that today. Young people today don't have the sense of privacy that we do or the sense of intellectual property. Things are much more openness and borderlessness. There is that sense. So what does that imply for the information systems? Will crowdsourcing change the communication infrastructure of science? That's what I'm particularly interested in. Crowdsourcing, peer review, is it going to be crowdsourced peer review kinds of things? It's a big question. The immigrants will say never, never in my lifetime. I'm not sure where the digital natives are coming out in that. So what are the implications for 2050? Really hard to think when you think about the science fiction out there and you think about where we are today, but you think about where we've come. It's really something that the last 2 days have been really quite eye-opening. And one of the conclusions I got from yesterday that I added is that, in fact, the culture today among the young people who don't take their head out of these computers is study is equal to work is equal to play. And those things are totally interrelated. I think what we heard this morning about the seasons and everything, that was just a perfect epitome of some of the work, study, and play coming together. So what are the recommendations? Obviously, more technology, more tools. You need to learn them, but not specific ones, because you see how rapidly they change. But you need to understand the life cycle of information and how these different tools play into that, the functional requirements of tools. Then you figure out which tools are delivering them. Today, however, you do have to add on some new versions of these functionalities and what are doing them. I think the interfaces, when I looked at Watson and I said, well, what does an information professional do to help be the creator of Watson? It's a lot of mathematics. It's a lot of modeling and simulation kinds of things. So how do we learn that in our schools if we're going to really be part of the future? And understanding of different user communities. I mentioned young to old, but there's also, today's world is a very interdisciplinary problem-solving world, and that was mentioned, I guess, Derek, you mentioned it. And, you know, at the macro level, global change is the problem, and that crosses disciplines. At the micro level, competitive business intelligence is done in a different way, but it's very interdisciplinary kinds of things. So recommendations, cross-cultural exposure and perspective, both in the classroom and out. Work and study and play, they're all merging. Somebody mentioned yesterday that when somebody has lived abroad, shows they're a risk taker, they have cross-cultural experience. This is a very positive thing in the way they look at future employees. And the media is part of the message. There's virtual everything, entrepreneurship, which we heard with Liz a lot about, which absolutely, even if it's not building a business, it's entrepreneurship or entrepreneurship in everything you think and do. You know, how can I change this for the better? Where are things going? Taking risks. Critical on-the-job experience is a differentiator. We're in incredibly economic competition in everything we do, in every job that people look toward, although having 100% placement is pretty impressive. Find out what they're doing. And so it is critical for you to differentiate yourself, for you to have on-the-job experience, and the schools have to provide these opportunities. So change has been in the works. It's going to get even more dramatically different. It really is hard to begin with 2050 and bring it home. I tried, but you're immediately back in your own worldly perspective. So what I think is the questions that we're asking each other, like, does it matter that you speak English or not? Or those kind of questions, is probably as significant as having any of the answers, which for 2050, if you do, I want to sign on to your business. I think getting the discussion going is really a great start, and I thank Gary and his team for really making these 2 days possible, because they've really been exciting. So, I got this out of somewhere. When you go in an airplane anymore, it ain't have a meal, right? It isn't even have peanuts, you know, coffee, tea, or batteries. Any questions? And I'll just leave that on as I depart.
Good afternoon. Is everybody still awake? Good. Well, I'm thrilled to be part of this conversation. And this is a lot easier than the last task I had when, in a former life in talking to librarians, because I had the unenviable task of trying to get librarians to pay for something, which, as you know, is almost impossible. I'm getting some nods over here. I was the founder and CEO of something called Information America, and we put the public records of the United States online, and some of our biggest customers were law librarians and government librarians and others, and back in the day, before, many of you don't even know this, people used to pay per search. They would actually pay each search. And then they would, and the good thing about the lawyers is then they'd bill the clients. So the librarians weren't really paying for it. They were just transferring over to the clients. That was a really good business for a while until Mosaic came along. And as I told some of our colleagues, I looked at Mosaic and said, oh my God, this is over. It's just not going to happen. The world is going to change fundamentally. And by that time, we were a public company. We ultimately sold it to West Publishing, that was then bought by Thomson, and it became somebody else's problem, which was good. And, but I think it's an example, frankly, of what I'd like to talk about today, which is that the world is changing. It's changing very fast, and that I think that information professionals have a choice, which is to either be part of addressing some of the really biggest problems facing the world today, or to confine themselves to focusing on smaller problems. And I would suggest to you, probably the reason I'm here today is that my colleague Holden Thorpe and I wrote a book called Engines of Innovation, the Entrepreneurial University in the 21st Century, where we suggest that universities specifically, and schools, information, iSchools, and libraries can have a bigger impact on the world's biggest problems. And what I'd like to do today is to talk to you a little bit about a way of thinking that might increase the impact of the work that you do. So let me just start by saying that, frankly, I think information professionals got kind of left at the starting gate on the two most important issues that our culture has faced in the last decade or two. First one being search, and you alluded to that we wrung our hands about search for a long time, and Google came along, and we looked up, and it was over. Completely, totally over. And iProfessionals played a marginal, if any, role in that process as search was revolutionized, and anyone who doubts whether Google has won, they make $1 billion a month right now. $1 billion a month on search, which was the province of iProfessionals. I think the other place we got left at the starting gate was design. Design. If you think about, well, there's all this talk about information appliances and what they were going to look like and all that kind of stuff, and then Steve Jobs came along and we all